This is the second to last essay that the grad students have to read for history of the Industrial Revolution in Britain. Um, the essay is entitled "Did Slavery Make Scotia Great?" by a T.M. Devine. All right. In his magnum opus, The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith famously asserted that colonies were usually a drain on the mother country. However, even Smith's authority could not lay to rest the question of whether empire in the later 18th century was a loss to the metropolis or a priceless resource of great material advantage to the mother country, as it developed toward economic transformation and industrialization. Much later in time, in 1944, Eric Williams published his seminal work, Capitalism and Slavery. In it, he not only made a stimulating contribution to the intellectual debate which Smith's assessment had encouraged, but raised the issues to a much more polemical and controversial level. Williams' focus centered on the role of the African people in the development of the world's first industrial revolution in Britain. Williams himself described his book as, quote, an economic study of the role of Negro slavery in the slave trade in providing the capital which financed the Industrial Revolution in England, end quote. Ironically enough, despite its later fame, if notoriety, this thesis formed a relatively small section of a much broader study which also included an analysis of how mature industrial capitalism was ultimately responsible for the destruction of the slave system. Moreover, at first the book provoked little reaction in scholarly circles. It was only in the 1960s that the response began. It proved to be unambiguously negative. A series of thoroughly researched and carefully argued articles stretching from the 1960s to the 1980s sought to demonstrate that the, quote, Williams thesis, end quote, did not stand up to serious scholarly scrutiny. Thus, one estimate published in Volume 2 of the Oxford History of the British Empire series concluded that the slave trade, though immense in scale, might only have added a mere 1% to total domestic investment in Britain by the later 18th century. Scholarship seemed to have delivered a final verdict on the Williams thesis. But that judgment was premature. From the 1980s, new perspectives began to emerge. Most importantly, some scholars argued that the approach of the skeptics was much too narrow. Not only should the slave trade itself be considered, but also, as Williams himself had implied, the total impact of the slave-based plantation economies of America and the Caribbean on Britain. These could not have existed, and even more importantly, have grown enormously in scale over time but for the labor input of untold numbers of black slaves. If the American colonies and the islands of the British Caribbean contributed markets, profits, capital, and raw materials to industrialism in the mother country, then those gains ultimately depended on the enslaved workers of those territories. It was an important shift of conceptual direction which gave a new and invigorating lease of life to the entire debate. A stream of books and articles by Robin Blackburn, Joseph Inikori, Barbara Salo, and others proceeded to place the, quote, Williams thesis, end quote, firmly back on the historical agenda. Even long-term skeptics, such as David Etlis and Stan Engerman, were forced to partially recant. They did not exactly swallow the revisionist view hook, line, and sinker, but root and branch opposition was now replaced by a cautious realignment of argument. Quote, African slavery thus had a vital role in the evolution of the modern West, but while slavery had important long-run economic implications, slavery did not by itself cause the British Industrial Revolution. It certainly, quote, helped, end quote, that revolution along, but its role was no greater than many other economic activities, end quote. Others were less restrained. In 2002, Joseph E. Inikori published a lifetime's work on the subject under the title Africans and the Industrial Revolution in England. Inikori's conclusion after presentation of a vast array of statistical and empirical evidence was unequivocal. Quote, the contribution of Africans was central to the origin of the Industrial Revolution in England, end quote. The critical response to his work nonetheless demonstrated that the debate was far from over. The Scottish dimension never really featured in these vigorous discussions. Perhaps this is not surprising given the persistent Anglo-centricity of modern English history. The cordon sanitaire between much of the historiography of England and Scotland, and the continued commitment of many Scottish historians to stick to their own patch, refusing to engage in major British and international debates. This is a pity, because, as will be argued in this essay, the Scottish experience has much to contribute to the discussion of the broader issues of slavery and capitalism, which currently interest a very wide audience of historians. Several of the participants in the debate refer to, quote, British, end quote, or, quote, Britain, end quote, in their analysis. Yet in their contributions there is precious little sign of any material being deployed for and against opposing views from north of the border. This may not entirely be the fault of colleagues in English and American universities. There has been a traditional belief in Scotland that Glasgow, unlike Bristol, Liverpool, and London, took little or no part in the mass transportation of Africans to the plantations of America and the West Indies. Even modern historiography, as recently as the early years of the new millennium, suffered from this 19th century amnesia. Much more attention has been paid to the role of the thinkers of the Scottish Enlightenment in their intellectual destruction of the moral and economic foundations of slavery, as well as the later leadership role of the Scottish churches in the abolitionist movement and the cause of black emancipation. As a result, darker aspects of the Scottish connection with the slave economies tended to be either played down or ignored altogether. In 2001, in a major compendium of modern scholarship, the Oxford Companion to Scottish History provided striking confirmation of this neglect. The index to the volume contained only one reference to the Caribbean sugar plantations, which related to the sale of Scottish linens in the West Indies. No index entry to, quote, slavery, end quote, appeared, and the single reference to the, quote, slave trade, end quote, was exclusively concerned with the abolition campaigns of the early 19th century, in which the Scots did indeed play an important and influential part. In the last few years, however, the research agenda has changed dramatically. Studies have now started to be published on the Scottish connection with the West India sugar colonies and the extent of Scottish involvement in slave trading itself or by proxy in Bristol, Liverpool, and London. A new interest has also developed in the impact of the slave-based economies on Scotland, which connects with older work on the relationship between the imperial trades and Scottish economic development. In consequence, there is now enough material as a result of past and ongoing research to consider, if only in a preliminary fashion, the ways in which slavery may have been a factor in 18th century Scottish development. It is unlikely, however, if new facts come to light, that Scottish involvement in direct slave trading from Africa to the Americas was of any great significance. Current research confirms the Victorian belief that Scottish ports played only a very minor role in that inhuman commerce. Around 3.5 million Africans were estimated to have been shipped across the Atlantic in British vessels before the slave trade was finally abolished in 1807. This table below indicates the minute level of direct Scottish participation in this traffic. I'm not going to read the chart. But this low rate of participation was not caused by any ethnic or moral opposition to the trade. As one historian of the abolitionist movement in Scotland has noted, at least until the 1760s, there was almost total white acceptance of the use of black men and women as slaves, end quote. Rather, the explanation seems to be that London and the English outports were already so well established in the Africa trade by the end of the 17th century that the Scots had to find their primary Atlantic commercial niches during subsequent decades in tobacco and sugar importation. As Jacob M. Price has argued, a form of port specialization developed along the west coast of Britain in the 18th century, with Bristol and Liverpool emerging as the premiering slaving centers, and Glasgow more and more active in the tobacco trade. Nevertheless, Scots did have a notable role in the slaving activities of English ports. In Liverpool, at least 5 Scots managed slaving firms. One of the 128 slaving captains sailing from the port during the later 18th century, who mentioned their origins, 25 were from Scotland, as were no less than 136 ship's surgeons. Many were in the employ of the two dominant Scots trading houses in Liverpool, Sam McDougall of Wigton, later a preeminent opponent of abolition, and the Todd brothers from Moffat. Scots were equally prominent in Bristol, one of the most powerful merchant dynasties in the north of Scotland. The Baileys of Dochfor, near Inverness, was partially founded on slave trafficking from Bristol. Robert Gordon from Moray was among the owners who managed 10 or more slave trading vessels in the city, and between 1745 and 1769 profited from 18 different voyages to East Africa. As David Hancock points out, however, it was in London that the Scots really made their mark. Around 1 in 10 of the African traders in the capital were Scots in the early 1750s, a number he reckoned increased in later decades. They were similarly heavily involved in the governance of the Company of Merchants trading to Africa as elected members of the company's Committee of Management. Scots were factors and surgeons in the company's ports where slaves were collected, and also acted as private traders searching the coastal waters of Sierra Leone and the Gold Coast for human cargoes. One of the most notable enterprises was founded in 1748 when a consortium of 5 Scots led by Richard Oswald, Augustus Boyd, and Alexander Grant took possession of a slave, quote, castle, end quote, on the Sierra Leone River at Bance Island, which was linked to a dozen, quote, out factories, end quote, or slave gathering points in the interior. The enterprise was staffed mainly by kinsmen and associates of the principals. Between 1748 and 1784, the firm and its satellite companies shipped nearly 13,000 blacks across the Atlantic, many of them to Scots plantation owners in the Caribbean. Hence, Victorian assumptions about Scotland's peripheral role in slave trafficking were largely unfounded. The evidence of recent research demonstrates full and enthusiastic Scottish engagement at every level of the trade. Yet, while the business may have made some Scot merchants rich, its scale was unlikely to have a profound impact on the overall economy of Scotland itself. To evaluate the connection between slavery and Scottish development, it is therefore necessary to extend the range of the inquiry from the trade itself to the plantation systems in the West Indies and the Chesapeake colonies, whose very existence depended on slave labor. The sugar, tobacco, and cotton produced by these slave-based economies were absolutely central components in Scottish overseas commerce for most of the 18th century, dominating the country's international trade to a much greater extent than the equivalent sectors south of the border. The trade in tobacco became the most remarkable example of Scottish commercial enterprise in the imperial economy during the course of the 18th century. In 1 year, 1758, Scottish tobacco imports from the colonies of Virginia and Maryland exceeded those of London, and the English outports of Bristol, Liverpool, and Whitehaven combined. 3 years later, the highest ever volume of tobacco leaf was landed in Scotland, a staggering 47 million pounds, which amounted to a third of all the nation's imports, and when then sold onto European and Irish markets, no less than 2/3 of its exports. On the eve of the American Revolution in 1773-4, the Scots were reckoned to control over half the trade in the key areas of new colonial tobacco production. Little wonder then one planter, William Lee, could proclaim, quote, "I think it is self-evident that Glasgow has almost monopolized Virginia and its inhabitants," end quote. Lee's reference to Glasgow is telling, although in earlier years other Scottish towns such as Ayr, Dumfries, Bowness, Lythe, Dundee, and Aberdeen were actively importing tobacco. The Glasgow merchants, through their 2 outports of Greenock and Port Glasgow, increasingly established a virtual stranglehold on the trade. As early as the 1710s, the Clyde's share of Scottish imports was already around 90%, and by the 1760s had climbed further to 98%. Glasgow was Scotland as far as the tobacco trade was concerned. It was not simply that the city's merchants were adept at crushing competition within the country, they also were formidable rivals within the broader imperial system. Over the middle decades of the century, they carved out an ever larger share of the British trade. As late as 1738, the Scots controlled only 10% of official UK tobacco imports. But this figure then rose to 20% in 1744, stood at 30% by 1758, and topped 40% in 1765. Voices were raised in alarm in London, Bristol, and elsewhere that if this trend continued for much longer, the Glaswegians would surely possess one of the nation's most lucrative Atlantic trades in its entirety. In an important sense, however, this dynamic business was much more than the simple acquisition of tobacco leaf from colonial planters based on slave labor, followed by sale to burgeoning consumer markets of France, Scandinavia, Holland, and the German states. The tobacco trade was Scotland's first global enterprise. Because of it, Glasgow became a player on the world commercial stage by the 1770s. To establish and refine their competitive position in the international marketplace, the city's merchants had to ensure they were able to service the needs of the colonial planter class for domestic articles, plantation equipment, household plenishings, clothing, luxuries, and a host of other items. American consumers became increasingly sophisticated purchasers as their material standards rose in the wake of expanding markets in Europe for colonial sugar, tobacco, timber, cotton, rice, and indigo. Some sense of the new consumerism comes from the New York press. In the 1720s, merchants there described only 15 different manufactured goods in newspaper articles. By the 1770s, they were selling over 9,000 different imported items, many of which had highly specific descriptions. Expanding custom in the tobacco colonies, therefore, increasingly meant that Scottish factories and storekeepers had to offer the widest possible range of goods to satisfy the new demands. That in turn meant that their Glasgow principles had to create secure lines of supply for the vast array of consumer goods needed across the Atlantic. A global business emerged. Wine came from Madeira and the Canary Islands, sugar and rum from the Caribbean, linen from Ireland, luxuries from Holland, and so on. The sources of supply ran from the Mediterranean to Russia and across the Atlantic to the West Indies and Canada. Quote, the shipping routes stretched from Glasgow like the ribs of a fan. And end quote. Quote, the shipping routes stretched from Glasgow like the ribs of a fan, end quote. I like that simile. And at home, tobacco merchants set up many of their own centers of production by investing massively in tanneries, bottle works, linen, sugar refining, breweries, ironworks, and other enterprises in Glasgow itself and in the countries around. The impact was also deeply felt on the other side of the Atlantic. If the needs of the colonial planter class for consumer goods and agricultural equipment were great, their requirements for credit were even more pressing. Especially in the newer areas of tobacco cultivation, such as the back country of Virginia, where the poorer planters were concentrated, credit was the lifeblood of the local economy. With capital provided by British merchants, planters could purchase slave labor and the tools necessary to expand cultivation and clear virgin land. In addition, the credit advance meant that the colonists could work through the months between harvests without denying themselves clothing, food, and other items. Credit made it possible to cope with the inevitable differences in timing inherent in the tobacco economy. Before the return of one year's crop had been harvested, the planters had to live and plant the next crop. In a sense, then, by extending liberal credit, the Scottish houses provided the development of capital for many parts of the Chesapeake. The resulting level of debt owed to the Scots rose steeply from an estimated £500,000 in the early 1760s to £1.3 million when the Revolution broke out in 1775. Credit on this scale provided evidence of yet another close Scottish link with the slave economies. It was not simply the merchant houses who gained, but also those whom they relied upon as sources of capital for transatlantic investment. As a late 18th century historian of Glasgow observed, quote, "The strength of the moneyed interest of the west of Scotland was embanked in it," end quote. The account books of the big companies reveal their remarkable capacity to attract interest-bearing loans on personal bonds from a very wide circle, far beyond the active managers and partners of the firms. The funds which helped to lubricate the Chesapeake trade were drawn from landowners, trustees, tradesmen, physicians, military officers, spinsters, widows, and university professors, among others. That also meant that profits of the tobacco business were widely distributed through these financial networks well beyond the ranks of the merchant community. The Scottish connection with the Caribbean sugar colonies has until recently attracted less scholarly attention than the American trades. For that reason, it will be given more extended consideration here than the tobacco business, on which there is already a substantial bibliography. As well as trading with them, Scots were heavily involved in plantation ownership, which was less common in the American colonies, and were also widely engaged in the management of the islands as government officials, military men, merchants, attorneys, surgeons, physicians, shopkeepers, and overseers. It was also striking that although the commercial relationship went back to the later 17th century, the connection strengthened considerably from the 1760s. This was especially so after the end of the 7 Years' War of 1763, precisely at the same time as the transformation of the Scottish domestic economy gathered pace. In total, there were an estimated 4,500 Scots in the Caribbean at the Union of 1707. These numbers remained relatively stable until the 1760s and then rose steeply to circa 17,000 new emigrants between 1750 and 1800, especially after the collapse of the tobacco trade in 1775, followed only by a muted recovery after 1783. The Scottish commercial relationship with the Caribbean achieved a massively new significance. The export share of British goods from Scottish ports to the islands accelerated dramatically. It rose from 21% of official value in 1781 to 42% by 1801, and then to 65% in 1813. The tonnage of Scottish shipping bound for the Caribbean by that date was no less than 50% greater than that to the European continent combined, and this was the key period of radical economic transformations in Scotland itself. In the 18th century, Britain's West Indian colonies were universally regarded as crucial to the empire. Even Adam Smith is already seen, one of the most eminent contemporary critics of the colonial system, waxed eloquent about their immense value. The profits of a sugar plantation in the Caribbean, he noted, quote, were generally much greater than those of any other cultivation that is known either in Europe or America, end quote. Edmund and William Burke also asserted in 1757 that nowhere in the world could great fortunes be made so quickly as in the West Indies. Their importance to the British state and economy were widely and fulsomely acknowledged. In 1700, the British Islands accounted for about 40% of all transatlantic sugar consignments. By 1815, the figure had reached 60%. At the end of the 18th century, the Caribbean colonies employed, directly or indirectly, half the nation's long-distance shipping. Their fixed and movable wealth was reckoned at more than £30 million sterling. Duties on West Indian produce accounted for an eighth of exchequer revenues, and the credit structures linked to the plantation economy were crucial elements in UK financial markets. The expansion of the British West Indian colonies was forged in the violent crucible of the Titanic conflicts with France over transatlantic hegemony. By the 1760s, the Leeward Islands, Antigua, St. Kitts, Nevis, Montserrat, and Jamaica had all been conquered or annexed. Further large-scale territorial gains took place after both the 7 Years' War, ending in 1763, and the Napoleonic Wars, ending in 1815. As a result of the first, Britain added Grenada, Dominica, St. Vincent, and Tobago, the ceded islands. By the second, the empire absorbed Trinidad, Demerara, and St. Lucia. Developments of these new colonies depended on a number of factions. The British laws of trade and navigation gave the islands a virtual monopoly of the protected home market for the products of tropical agriculture, when commodities such as sugar by the 1750s were selling at prices some 50% higher than in continental Europe. The West Indies at the time also exported rum, molasses, and especially after circa 1760, fed the factories of the early Industrial Revolution with cargoes of raw cotton. But sugar was king. It is reckoning that sugar consumption in England and Wales alone increased about 20-fold in the period between 1663 to 1775. Between 1771 and 1775, colonial imports topped 1.8 million hundredweights. Consumption per head in Britain rose spectacularly from about £4 in 1700 to £10 by 1748, and then to £20 in 1800. The Caribbean response to the burgeoning sugar markets in Europe was built on two key foundations: the evolution of the plantation system and the intensive use of black slave labor. Some islands soon became little more than vast sugar plantations. It was said, for instance, of Antigua in 1751 that the land was, quote, improved to the utmost, there being hardly 1 acre of ground, even to the top of the mountains, fit for sugar canes and other necessary produce, but what is taken and cultivated, end quote. These were also, quote, slave societies, end quote, in the sense of human communities which depended above all else on unfree forced labor for their very existence. Without the slave, the sugar economies of the Caribbean would have been impossible. By 1750, black Africans comprised about 85% of the population of the British West Indies. It was scarcely surprising that the contemporary commentator Malachi Postlethwaite, P.O. Fucking check this guy's name. Malachy, first name. Second name, Postlehwayt. It's a hell of a name. It's like from a Dickens story. Writing in 1745 in the African Trade, the great pillar and support of this British plantation trade in America, could report that the nation's transatlantic commercial empire ultimately rested on an African foundation. Slaves outnumbered whites by 6-1 in 1760 and by 12-1 in 1815. Most whites were transients hoping to make a quick fortune and return home as quickly as possible with their profits. Despite the fabled riches of the Caribbean, however, few actually managed to achieve their dreams, but one consequence was that British West Indian whites failed to develop, quote, integrated, locally rooted societies comparable with the North American colonies, end quote. Even Scottish migrants failed to leave the classic ethnic stamp of their schools and churches on the Caribbean islands where they settled. This was not the only point of distinction between the two colonial systems. Another was the dramatic difference in the treatment of blacks. Not for nothing was the Caribbean known as the graveyard of the slaves. By the standards of unfree labor in the North American plantation colonies, human suffering in the West Indies was especially horrendous. About 1830, crude deaths in the USA and Jamaica were 20 and 26 per thousand, respectively. The differences in birth rates were even more dramatic, 50 and 23 per thousand, respectively. It was reckoned in the 1750s that a quarter of all slaves died within 3 years of arrival, but averages often concealed much higher figures. On the Codrington plantations in Barbados between 1741 and 1746, 43% of all African Negroes died within 3 years of arrival. Partly this was based on an inhumane calculation. Planters generally believed that until the late 18th century, that buying, quote, salt water, end quote, blacks straight off the slave ships was, quote, cheaper, end quote, than encouraging family life and reproduction of the existing stock. Thus, it was common practice for plantations to buy slaves at crop time and set them to work with little or no time spent on, quote, seasoning and, quote, acclimatization. By definition, also, slavery was an oppressive regime where work was always managed by the threat of severe punishment. Coercion reached especially rigorous and exacting levels in the Caribbean because the grossly skewed ratios of whites and blacks generated rancorous fear and paranoia among British planters about the potential menace of slave rebellions. Essentially, however, the high levels of slave mortality were caused fundamentally by the unrelenting nature of the plantation regime. The slave gangs on the sugar estates toiled from dawn to dusk to land preparation, harvesting the canes and boiling sugar. In the Caribbean, about 90% of the slaves worked in these tasks. One scholar estimates that it was, quote, probably one of the highest labor participation rates anywhere in the world, end quote. The arduous toil helps to explain why about half of British West Indies slave women never bore a child in the mid-18th century. On the American mainland, there was not the same intensity of work on a single crop. Tobacco cultivation, tending farms, cutting timber, and domestic services were just some of the varied range of tasks undertaken. Recent work on slave skeletal remains in Barbados burial grounds by nutritionists and anthropologists has added a new dimension to an understanding of slave mortality in the Caribbean. These results point unambiguously to malnutrition as a vital factor in reducing the immunity of the black population to the epidemic diseases which infested the low-lying plantations and their malignant environments. Nor should the human factor be neglected in this account. The Caribbean was notorious for planter absenteeism. In 1832, 84% of a total of 646 sugar estates were owned by absentees or minors, like minors, minors. Proprietors were normally keen to escape back home because of the low life expectancy in the tropics as soon as they had managed to make enough for independent leisured living in Britain. By 1800, it was their attorneys, managers, and overseers who actually ran most plantations in the West Indies, and in these positions, Scots were often preeminent. This class was committed to maximizing production not simply to satisfy the expectations of their masters, but because they also were determined to get rich quickly and to return to spend their last years in more congenial surroundings than the West Indian islands. The pervasive culture of avarice engendered a regime of unrelenting and pitiless rigor on the slave plantations. Untold numbers of blacks were quite literally worked to death. It is hardly surprising, therefore, that modern scholarship has identified the islands of the British West Indies as the location of the most deadly and destructive system of chattel slavery in the New World. Only in the later decades of the 18th century, when the policy on most estates altered in favor of breeding new generations of black labor rather than simply purchasing, quote, salt water, end quote, slaves off the ships from West Africa, did a distinct trend develop toward amelioration. After 1807, when the slave trade to British territories was outlawed, that process became unstoppable. By the 1770s, Jamaica had become the dominant island in the British Caribbean economy, its wealth estimated at over 28 million compared to 50 million for the rest of the West Indian Empire combined. Jamaica alone accounted for 40% of the slave population of the British West Indies in the same decade. It was described in the mid-18th century as a, quote, constant mine which Britain draws prodigious riches, end quote. Jamaica, by the later 18th century, had replaced Barbados as the economic powerhouse of the British Caribbean. Its white Jamaicans were the richest citizens in the Americas, quote, with individual wealth and income exceeding by a significant margin those of whites in mainland British America, end quote. And it was slavery which made the planters and merchants rich. In B.W. Higman's words, quote, their worth in turn derived from most particularly the ownership of human beings. The enslaved who worked in the field and factory, the riches of the planters were founded upon an extremely unequal distribution of wealth in which most people did not even have legal possession of their own bodies, but rather were counted as part of the tradable capital stock. End quote. God, this shit's horrific. In his famous Fount of Profit, the Scots were very active as plantation owners, attorneys, overseers, and physicians. Edward Long, the planter historian of the colony, famously claimed, quote, "Jamaica indeed is greatly indebted to North Britain, as very nearly one strand of the inhabitants are either natives of that country or descendants from those who were. Many have come from the same quarter every year, less in quest of fame than of fortunes," end quote. The evidence of wills and testaments confirms Long's assertion. Between 1771 to 1775, Scots accounted for nearly 45% of all inventories at death valued at more than £1,000 sterling. Further, roughly 2/5 of the personal property inventories belonged to Scots in the same period. The Scottish connection went back as far as the ill-fated Darien expedition of the 1690s and before. Some of the survivors of the disaster settled in Jamaica, and one of the most prominent was Colonel John Campbell from Inverary, who had been captain of troops at Darien. By his death in 1741, he had become a member of both the Jamaica Assembly and Council and the influential patron of large number of young kingsmen and associates on the island from Argyll and Europe. Edward Long noted in 1774, quote, I have had a computation model. What am I saying? Quote, I have had a computation made of no fewer than 100 of the name Campbell, actually resident in it, Jamaica, all claiming alliance with the Argyll family, end quote. The Scots were also overrepresented among the ranks of the professional classes, physicians, surgeons, and attorneys who actually managed the sugar estates on behalf of absentee owners. In 1750, over 60% of doctors in Antigua were Scots or Scottish trained, and there is no reason to believe that the pattern in other British islands was very much different. Some of these physicians also diversified into merchanting, slave trading, and plantation ownership. The common view was that attorneys and overseers in Jamaica were usually men from Scotland. Lady Nugent, soon after her arrival on the island in 1801, took the view that, quote, almost all the agents, attorneys, merchants, and shopkeepers are of that country, bracket, Scotland, end bracket, and really do deserve to thrive in this. They are so industrious, end quote. Modern historians have made similar comments in confirmation. A strong Scottish presence was noted in other islands. When St. Kitts was credited to Britain in 1713, half the land divisions of 100 acres and above went to Scots. In the later 18th century, most of the white population of Tobago were Scotsmen, while in Grenada, by 1772, 54 Scots, over half of British landowners, possessed 40% of all land planted in sugar and coffee. As more and more territory was won from the French from the 1760s, it too offered fresh opportunity for Scottish investment in Antigua, Dominica, Vincent, Trinidad, and Guyana. As Sir William Forbes, the established Edinburgh banker, recorded in his memoirs, quote, extensive speculations were entered by some Scotsmen for the purchase and cultivation of lands in the newly acquired West India Islands, end quote. A distinctive profile began to emerge. Unlike the pattern in the Chesapeake, Scots in the Caribbean became major owners of plantations and the armies of slave laborers who worked them. Here the Scottish connection with slavery was direct, unambiguous, and immediate. In another sense, however, the Scottish links with the Caribbean had important parallels with those to the American colonies. If the American trade had its rich, quote, tobacco lords, end quote, West Indian commerce could boast its, quote, sugar princes, end quote. Both produced merchants and firms of immense wealth, and with the financial surpluses which might have allowed for large-scale investment in the Scottish domestic economy. Glasgow's sugar merchants were a small elite numbering around 80 individuals in the partnerships which dominated the trade. Among them was a minor group of only a couple dozen families who ran much of the business. The giant firm was Alexander Houston and Company, with assets in trade, land, and industry in both Scotland and the West Indies, valued at £630,000 in 1801. When it showed signs of collapse in the 1790s, the government itself was forced to step in, so disastrous would its failure have been for the Scottish economy as a whole. Immediately below the vast Houston organization were firms such as John Campbell Sen and Co., with assets of £179,000 in 1814, Robert Dunmore and Co., Dennistown, Buchanan and Co., Leitch and Smith, Robert Mackay and Co., and Sterling Gordon and Co. Several of the merchant destinies who made up these partnerships also owned Caribbean plantations, but the primary role of the firms was essentially to act as the selling agents in the UK and Europe for sugar, rum, and coffee, provide credit and advances for slave purchases, and organize the Scottish export trade to the West Indies. From their ranks were also drawn Glasgow's political elite after 1780, the provost, councillors, and officers of the Merchants' House and the Chamber of Commerce who governed the city down to the early 19th century. They established the Glasgow West India Association in 1807, which by the 1820s had become a vocal and robust opponent of the movement of slave emancipation. While anti-slavery petitions were being generated from all over Scotland, the association and its loyal press ally, the Glasgow Courier, vigorously defended the interests of the slave owners against the, quote, spread of evil so much to be dreaded, end quote, which in their view, if emancipation came, would be catastrophic for the fortunes of the city. The evidence surveyed thus far suggests that Scotland had a deep and growing association with the two principal slave trading economic systems in the 18th century Atlantic Empire: Virginia, Maryland, and North Carolina on the American mainland, and the sugar islands of the Caribbean in the south. To the south. But what impact did this relationship have on Scotland's domestic transformation in this period? In England, the debate on slavery and industrial capitalism, despite the innovative work of Innicorrie, Salo, and others, remains unresolved. Indeed, one very recent contribution to the discussion has insisted that, quote, sugar cultivation and the slave trade did not form an especially large part of the British economy, end quote. Such a conclusion is hardly surprising because the revisionists who search for a key link between slavery and capitalism in England face considerable evidential and conceptual difficulties in order to produce a convincing thesis. On the eve of the Industrial Revolution, England was already a rich, highly developed, and sophisticated economy with substantial urban growth and a highly commercialized agricultural system, making it one of the most developed societies in Europe. English industrialization probably had no need for the finance from the external sectors like the colonial trades to move forward by that period. The system was quite capable of replenishing itself from replowing of profits to provide for further growth and from the existing surplus wealth of the contemporary domestic economy. In addition, econometric studies suggest that the idea of a radical change in economic direction during this period in England, at least implied by the term, quote, revolution, end quote, is overdrawn. The route to economic modernity was long and evolutionary rather than an experience of short-term dramatic transformation. In this perspective, once again, the resulting modest increments in capital supply could all easily be achieved from within the existing domestic system. As the late Michael Postan once asserted, quote, there were enough rich people in the country, bracket England, end bracket, to finance an economic effort far in excess of the modest activities of the leaders of the Industrial Revolution, end quote. However, it may well be that Scotland could provide more fertile ground for the revisionists. It was a country which was in much greater need of external markets and supplies of capital during the industrialization process than its much richer and more advanced neighbor to the south. North of the border and up until the early 19th century, when convergence between the two countries accelerated rapidly, the structures of the Scottish economy were distinctive and different. First is indicated by contrasting wage rates and the persistence of subsistence relationships in much of agriculture. Scotland, circa 1750, was a much poorer society. Indeed, a few decades earlier, in the 1690s, a series of harvest failures and trade crises had unambiguously demonstrated the fragility of the nation's economy. It took at least a generation for Scotland to experience sustained recovery from these disasters. Second, the current consensus among most Scottish historians is that from around the 1750s and the 1760s, a clear and decisive break with the past was taking place. The comparative evidence suggests before forced Soviet industrialization by the state in the late 19... Spacing out. Second, the current consensus among most Scottish historians is that from around 1750s and the 1760s, a clear and decisive break with the past was taking place. The comparative evidence suggests before forced Soviet industrialization by the state in the 1920s and 1930s, few societies, if any, in Europe could equal the speed and scale of the Scottish transformation. In other words, the term, quote, industrial revolution, end quote, is still viewed as having profound and legitimate resonance in a Scottish context. Third, the foundational extent of these rapid changes needs to be stressed. Growth was not simply confined to a, quote, leading sector, end quote, of textile-based industrialization in cotton and linen, where it may indeed have been at its most dynamic. The whole of Scottish society was being recast between the mid-18th and early 19th centuries, a key indicator of the dash towards modernity and the pace of urbanization. In 1750, only 1 in 8 Scots lived in towns defined as urban communities of 4,000 or more inhabitants, a very much lower proportion than that of England. By the 1820s, it was more like 1 in 3. Further, the transformation was that by the 1820s, it was more like 1 in 3. Further, the transformation was not confined to manufacturing industry in the urban areas. In the 2 decades after circa 1760, the Scottish countryside took on a recognizably modern form, with enclosed fields, trim farms, and separate individual holdings, a set of changes which had taken many generations to achieve south of the border. North of the Highland Line, Gaeldom moved from tribalism to capitalism over scarcely more than 2 generations. Fourth, unlike England, the Scottish domestic market was relatively small and grew only slowly in the 18th century. In the 1750s, the population was around 1.25 million and had only risen to 1.6 million in 1801. The annual growth rate of 0.6% was just over half that of England, primarily because of high net levels of emigration and significantly behind the Irish increase of 2.1% over the longer period 1791 to 1821. Not surprisingly, therefore, historians of Scotland place much more emphasis on external markets, partly in England, but more commonly across the Atlantic, as the strategic course of demand for the vastly increasing flow of goods now turned out by the nation's mills, weaving shops, and iron works. Throughout the 19th century, this overseas orientation became even more evident. Against this background, it can be argued that the slave-based economies of the Atlantic had a powerful impact on Scottish economic growth Against this background, it can be argued that the slave-based economies of the Atlantic had a powerful impact on Scottish economic growth as a source of raw materials for the new industrialism, market expansion, and capital transfers to manufacturing, mining, and agriculture. Before the 1830s, the Scottish Industrial Revolution was mainly limited to the textiles of cotton and linen. Metal manufacture was laggard and only came into its own from the 1830s and 1840s onward. The establishment of the famous Cairn Company in 1759 and a flurry of iron works opened before 1801 proved to be a false dawn. No new companies were floated between that date and 1824. While output did rise for a time, the rate of expansion was markedly slower than that in England. On the other hand, textiles were dominant, accounting for the employment of 257,900 workers, or 89% of all recorded manufacturing jobs. The fastest rise was in mechanized cotton spinning, which in turn depended on the expansion of raw material supplies from the plantation economies of the West Indies and the American South. In fact, the connection was catalytic. During the American Revolutionary War, several Glasgow tobacco houses switched their interest to the sugar islands of the Caribbean. Merchant correspondence reveals that while the most lucrative opportunities lay in the importation of sugar, planters drove hard bargains and forced firms to take raw cotton as well. In consequence, cotton coming into the Clyde virtually halved in price since between 1776 and 1780. Quote, "This was one of the factors which appears to have persuaded numerous former linen and silk merchants and manufacturers to concentrate activities on cotton spinning and weaving." End quote. Until well into the 1790s, the quote sea island end quote cotton from the Caribbean provided the leading sector of the Scottish Industrial Revolution with the vital raw material for its mills and workshops, until being replaced after that period by the southern states of the USA, another slave-based economic system. These economies were also key markets for Scottish textile producers and other manufacturers. David Eltis and Stan Engerman stress that, quote, "All scholars recognize the bracket English and bracket domestic market to have been much larger than the Caribbean," end quote. Perhaps so, but it was a different story for Scotland precisely when the population of the American tobacco colonies added to those of the West Indian Islands. Between 1651 and 1851, the population of England rose from 5.2 million to 6.7 million. Scottish population was 1.2 million in 1755, and by 1801 had only grown to 1.6 million. In 1851, the total stood at 2.8 million. For such a relatively small country, the Atlantic markets came as a much bigger and decisive bonus than for England. In 1770, the population of the British American colonies was 2.7 million. The British Caribbean population was 760,000 in 1801, most of them slaves who represented a potentially enormous market for provisions and cheap clothing. By 1810, the number of Africans in the Sugar Islands and the plantation areas of North America had expanded to just over 2 million. Scottish exports to the American mainland colonies at official values averaged 97,962 pounds in 1740 to 44, then tripled to 298,922 pounds from 1770 to 1770 to, I guess, 1840. I don't know. It says 1770 to 14. I don't know what the hell that means. This was significant, but much more crucial to the domestic economy, however, was the market for, quote, slave cloth, end quote, in the Caribbean. Demand there helps to explain why, as already seen, the West Indies took such an increasing share of exports from Scotland of home-produced goods of the late 18th century, rising from 21% at official values in 1781 to 65% in 1813. Here the strategic factor was linen manufacture. Linen was by a long way Scotland's largest manufacturing industry and biggest industrial employer in the 18th century. Between 1746 and the 1790s, the output of cloth more than doubled in volume and trebled in value. Even after the 1780s, when the dramatic expansion of cotton captured attention, linen production continued apace. Official output again rose threefold to reach nearly 27 million yards, usually in 1813 to 17. Work in linen spinning, weaving, and finishing was critical to the way of life of countless Scottish families. Contemporary estimates suggest that about 40,000 weavers worked for the market in the 1780s, and just under 170,000 women found their, quote, chief employment, end quote, in the spinning of linen yarn. When some of the finishing trades are included, full and part-time linen employment in that decade may have occupied more than 230,000 men, women, and children. Little wonder that John Naismith could remark in 1790 that, quote, the linen manufacture has been the most universal source of wealth and happiness introduced into Scotland. To how many thousands has it afforded bread for these 40 years past? End quote. In broader terms, the industry was divided into two types of specialization. Most Scottish production concentrated on the cheaper and coarser linens, which in turn were heavily geared to satisfying the needs of the export market. Fife, Angus, and Perthshire were the dominant centres of these trades. Fine manufacture for lawns and cambrics tended to focus more on Glasgow and the western counties of Renfrewshire and Lanarkshire. The finer production was more oriented to the home market than in the regions of east-central Scotland. In that last area, the imperial factor was crucial in three ways. The industry enjoyed the protection of a high tariff wall against European competition. Second, the system of bounty payments set up by the state in 1743 to boost cloth export to the colonies was vital. From 1745, boundaries were also extended to low-priced cloth, which generated a dramatic increase in linen exports to the plantations across the Atlantic in the years that followed. Throughout the 18th century, 80 to 90% of these exports were supported by the bounty, and when it was temporarily withdrawn in 1754, the output of some of the coarser linens halved, only to recover vigorously when the subsidy was restored 2 years later. Third, the colonial markets were critical to growth. European consumption was marginal and Ireland of minor significance. 9/10 of all Scottish linen exported from Scotland went to North America and the West Indies. After the American War, the Caribbean became even more important. In the last quarter of the 18th century, the standards of living of countless working-class families in the eastern lowlands of Scotland came to depend on the huge market for cheap linen clothing among the slave population of Jamaica and the Leeward Islands. Moreover, out of this specialization came the global industry of jute, centered on Dundee. Jute was to that city what shipbuilding was to Glasgow. In due course, Dundee rejoiced in the name Juteopolis. The final issue to be considered is that of capital transfers from merchanting and plantation ownership in the slave-based economies to Scotland. Previous work by this author have revealed very significant investment by tobacco and West Indian traders in Scottish industry, commercial infrastructure, and land in the key decades of economic transformation between circa 1750 and circa 1800. Manufacturing industry in Glasgow and the west of Scotland gained very significantly from colonial merchant capitalism after circa 1730. Around 80 industrial units in ironworking, sugar houses, glassworks, and soapworks gained, but the decisive capital transfers were in textiles, where no less than 46 enterprises were involved. Above all, West India merchant capital was often vital for the two big cotton spinning firms which dominated the industry before 1815. Two houses, Leitch and Smith and Sterling, Gordon and Co., were key shareholders in James Finlay and Co., which by the early 19th century owned 3 major mill complexes and was probably the single largest producer of cottons in Scotland. Similarly, 2 of the partners in John Campbell Sen and Co. and one of the members of the Dennistown Buchanan and Co. contributed £70,000 of total capital of £150,000 in the new Lanark Company between 1810 and 1812. The 2 last-mentioned West India firms were also connected through Alexander Campbell and Robert Dennistown with Robert Humphreys and Co., cotton spinners of Hutchison Glasgow, in which the West India interest held £20,000 of the £32,000 capital in 1816. The Dennistown family were involved in a variety of other firms, such as John Monteith and Co. and Reynolds. Monteith and Co., cotton spinners of Renfrewshire, circa 1795, and more importantly in the formation of the company which developed the major Stanley cotton mills in Perthshire. Monteith, Bogle and Co., the owners of the cotton complex at Blantyre in Lanarkshire, also drew on the resources of 2 West India houses. Alexander Garden of the Caribbean firm of Francis Garden and Co. became a member of Monteith, Bogle and Co. through his marriage with the daughter of its leading partner, Henry Monteith, and Adam Bogle. The other major partner was not only a scion of long-established merchant family in Glasgow, but was also a member of Robert Bogle John and Co., a leading West India house in the city. Furthermore, it was reckoned that Alexander Houston and Co. had about £20,000 invested in the cotton industry at the time of the firm's bankruptcy, and Robert Dunmore was the leading figure behind the establishment of the Ballindalloch Cotton Co. in Stirlingshire. Other spin-offs from the tobacco and sugar trades were the foundation of Glasgow's first 3 banks and investment in both the Forth and Clyde and Monklands canals. There was a huge outflow of funds from colonial commerce into the purchase of landed estates, with well over half of the Glasgow colonial merchant elite involved, and a grand total of at least 140 properties acquired in the borough itself and the surrounding counties. Even this impressive figure, however, does not do full justice to the capital repatriated from the Caribbean because it is confined to merchant portfolios and does not include possible investments of plantation owners in Scottish land. Initial investigations not only suggest that this was very significant, but, unlike that of the merchant princes considered here, their purchase of estates was across much of the Scottish countryside and not contained in any way to the west central region. This essay is attempted to describe a strategic connection between the Atlantic slave-based economies and Scotland's great leap forward in the second half of the 18th century. The relationship was arguably a potent one, especially in relation to raw material supply for the cotton manufacture expanding in new markets and capital transfers to industry and agriculture. It has been argued that these external influences were especially vital to Scottish development given the country's traditional poverty and the relatively small size of its own internal market. However, although the impact of the plantation economies is deemed to be catalytic, it was by no means the only cause of the Scottish Industrial Revolution. The commitment of the landed elites to economic transformation, indigenous levels of skills and education, the rationalizing of Enlightenment thought, and natural endowment, inter alia, were all part of the mix. Also, the slave-based economies were of fundamental importance in the first textile-dominated phase of Scottish industrialization, but had little relevance to the second after circa 1830, which was based on iron, steel, and engineering, not least because by then the capital resources of the nation were much more advanced. In addition, recent research has shown that the Indian Empire was an important source of external funds, again, By no means did the Atlantic have a monopoly, yet it would seem that Asian resources repatriated by Scots in the East India Company's service and by private merchants tended on the whole to be invested in land ownership in terms of current knowledge rather than in industry. So the story is a complex one, but even when all the necessary qualifications are made, the central argument remains that the Atlantic slave-based economies were indeed fundamental to Scotland's 18th century transformation. There's a final irony here. Scotland's growing prosperity increasingly rested after circa 1760 on the profits and markets of the transatlantic slave-based plantation economies. Yet precisely at the same time, some of the towering figures of the Scottish Enlightenment were building a formidable moral, economic, and philosophical case against black slavery. As one scholar has put it, quote, in the latter half of the 18th century, the anti-slavery idea ran along filaments of an Atlantic intellectual web, at the center of which sat the thinkers of the Scottish Enlightenment. End quote. Scottish empirical philosophy, notably in the writings of Francis Hutcheson, emphasized sympathy and fellow feeling between human beings as the keystone of proper ethical behavior. That idea of benevolence was in direct conflict with the slave system. Adam Smith also attacked it from the standpoint of economic pragmatism. Quote, the work done by slaves, although it appears to cost only their maintenance, is in the end dearest of all. End quote. Equally, one of Smith's star pupils, John Millar, in his influential observations concerning the distinction of ranks, 1771, argued that slavery was a cancer in the very heart of any civilized society, likely to cause continuous rebellion from those subject to coercion and inducing luxury among those who own them. In time, these contributions fed into the great arsenal of ideas which destroyed slavery in the British Empire, and also helped to explain why Scotland was so significant in the struggle for emancipation that it ended in victory in 1833. But in the short term, the intellectual assault on slavery remained insulated from the daily existence of countless Scots in the plantation economies and the African trade. The enormous vested interest involved won over abstract theory. The correspondence of Scots merchants and managers to their relatives at home reveals little concern with the morality of slavery in the later 18th century. This is apparently the case among those who had been exposed to the condemnations of the intellectuals. One of the most forthright opponents of black slavery was James Beattie, who held the chair of moral philosophy in Marischal College, Aberdeen. In his Elements of Moral Science, 1790, he fulminated against this outrageous moral evil, which he described as, quote, utterly repugnant to every principle of reason, religion, humanity, and conscience, end quote. But Beattie also admitted that some of his students found employment in the slave-based societies of the empire, despite his, quote, pleading the case of the poor Africans, end quote, in his teaching. He recognized that, quote, many of my pupils have gone to the West Indies, end quote, and he could only maintain the pious hope that, while there, the principles he had enunciated would guide their, quote, conduct to their unfortunate brethren, end quote.